is something that belongs to the defendant in most cases, right? The power to move things forward. A defendant has a right to a speedy trial. If a defendant wants the case to move forward quickly, that defendant can help in moving that process forward. So if Maduro and his wife decide, we don't want this to take months and months and months, we want to get this going in 60 days, 3 months, etc., they could try to push forward with a case. But I would expect that this will at least take a number of months, if not much longer.
And if convicted, you mentioned this earlier, what does Maduro face here?
Up to life in prison, and with minimums of 10 and 20 years just on the most serious charges, right? I mean, then you've got additional charges as well. So, if he's convicted here, you're talking about, effectively a life sentence for him, you would think. We'll see. The judge will have enormous discretion when it comes to sentencing. There's always the possibility that he's not convicted of the most serious charges. Again, as we talked about a moment ago, there could be a different case against his wife. And so as a result, his wife might not be convicted of certain charges. They might not be convicted of anything. We shall see. But when it comes to sentencing, the judge has enormous discretion in a case like this.
Dan Abrams, stay with us here for our live coverage. The arraignment of Nicolas Maduro playing out in New York City in federal court. Here in Lower Manhattan, the pictures you see, intense security outside that courtroom. Inside, Aaron Katersky, our chief investigative correspondent, describing a very similar scene. Very heavy security inside that courthouse, a K-9 unit in the hallways. We have just learned that Nicolas Maduro and his wife are both wearing headphones inside that courtroom to listen to the interpreter. These headphones obviously provided by the court. Maduro has taken his seat next to his defense attorney, Barry Polak, and immediately began writing on a notepad. His wife is seated next to her attorney, Mark Donnelly. Apparently, she has her hands folded on the table. Judge Alvin Hellerstein introducing himself and saying he would assure a fair processing. That's my job, he said. That is my intent. And when he says a fair proceeding here, he's talking about an arraignment on these charges, a description of these charges. Dan, he will describe what both Maduro and his wife face.
Correct. They will be informed of the charges against them. That's really the point of this proceeding. This is not supposed to be particularly substantive. This is not where he begins to present a defense. This is basically to start the process moving forward. This is, you show up in court, you're informed of what you're charged with, and now the process begins.
Dan Abrams, our chief legal correspondent, stay with us here. I want to bring in Martha Raddatz, who's also following these breaking developments here. ABC News live coverage of Nicolas Maduro and his wife now being arraigned on narco-terrorism charges. Dan listing the charges here just moments ago, both inside that courtroom wearing headphones to listen to what it is they face here now in the U.S. Martha, you've had extensive reporting of this U.S. military operation. We heard the president, when he came out afterwards and first addressed the nation on this, saying that Nicolas Maduro and his wife were captured as they tried to get to that safe room on their compound. He said it was within moments of closing the door they got him before he could close the door behind him. What an extraordinary shifting of scenes here. Now he's inside this federal courthouse, shackled.
Astonishing, from a presidential compound to a seat in a courtroom in New York. Really an astonishing development. And what is even more astonishing is that military operation, as you know, David, a tactical success. It seemed to be a flawless operation, but there were bloody gun battles. We are learning, the Cubans say, 32 Cubans were killed. Now, the Cubans were doing security for Maduro, so it is likely, we know there was gunfire when the U.S. elite Delta Force approached that compound, got near Maduro. There was gunfire that broke out. 32 Cubans apparently killed in that. And Donald Trump has now revealed that the Americans who were wounded were helicopter pilots. We saw those helicopters going over Caracas. They had flown over the waters at about 100 feet, those dark waters arriving, and there was gunfire apparently then. Now, some of those helicopters and some of the other warplanes overhead providing support took out air defenses, but apparently some of those helicopter pilots were hit. They managed to keep flying the helicopters. President Trump said they were bleeding hurting badly, but still kept on. We don't know exactly whether those were gunshot wounds or shrapnel, perhaps, from the helicopter getting hit, but they were able to keep flying those helicopters. When they approached Maduro and his wife, they gave up, according to President Trump, on their way to try to get behind those steel doors. But I can tell you, David, even if they'd gotten behind those steel doors, the Delta Force could have gotten them out of there. They would have blasted their way in through those doors and breached those heavy steel doors, because they had practice on an exact replica of that compound. That compound was within a military installation, but they had been following. A CIA team on the ground knew exactly where they were, where they had gone, and that's why they built a replica, the Delta Force, and were practicing for months in breaching this breaching this compound, David.
Your universal praise for members of the U.S. military in carrying out that very dangerous operation. And of course, the tough questions now come afterward, and not for the U.S. military, but instead for the Trump administration on how we move forward, given the fact that, again, overnight, President Trump has said that the U.S. is in control of Venezuela. We heard Secretary of State Marco Rubio in the last 24 hours, in particular on the Sunday shows here in the U.S., trying to dial back, if you will, some of that rhetoric, saying we'll apply pressure on Venezuela, the embargo on the oil tankers, in addition to other steps taken by the U.S. military and the presence that still very much remains in that region. Secretary Rubio saying that pressure would push Venezuela in a direction that the U.S. would determine whether or not they were listening and following along, and whether or not the U.S. military would have to indeed take any kind of secondary action here. The president clearly said again last night, though, that instead the U.S. is simply in charge now. In this courtroom, you're looking at federal court here in Manhattan, where ousted Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, captured by the U.S. military over the weekend, is shackled, sitting in court, wearing a pair of headphones provided by the court. So is his wife, sitting not far from him in that courtroom. We now know that Maduro stood before the judge. Are you Sir Nicolas Maduro Mores? The judge asking. Maduro declared through an interpreter, "I am the president of Venezuela." He said, "I was captured at my home in Caracas, Venezuela," before the judge interrupted and told him there would be time later to challenge his custody. Maduro then affirmed he is who the judge said he is, which was, of course, the initial question. Also an extraordinary development. Our chief international correspondent, James Longman, in the region on the border of Venezuela. And when you hear Nicolas Maduro, James, immediately try to take an opportunity to establish before that court that he remains the president of Venezuela. "I was captured in Caracas at my home," before the judge interrupted him and said, "You'll have your chance to make your case later."
Yeah, David, and that goes to the heart of this, because in many senses, nothing has really changed inside Venezuela. Yes, we had the theater and the drama of his capture, but his regime remains, and that is why there is so much uncertainty about this situation. I'm here in Colombia on the border with Venezuela in Cúcuta. You can see a massive Colombian military presence here. They are terrified about this situation spiraling out of control, and we see a massive migration crisis fueled by Donald Trump's intervention on Friday. Goes against precisely one of the things that elected Donald Trump in the first place, which was a vow to stop mass migration. So that has got to be one of the massive concerns here in Colombia. Anyway, I want to take you across here because you can see it's very busy. This road is open as usual because every day tens of thousands of Venezuelans cross over to go shopping. Goods are much cheaper on this side of the border than they are in Venezuela. Massive inflation makes life just much more difficult for the average Venezuelan. And I just want to walk you through. Venezuelans we speak to, every single one of them, without exception, says they're happy that Maduro is gone. That's really important to say, but it is not the whole picture because they're conscious that the rest of the regime remains. I just spoke to one man who actually, we stood on this bridge here and he cried in front of me, saying he's not sure if he's ever going to see his sons again. But he was very, very circumspect. He didn't want to go into too much detail because he knows Maduro's regime lives on. David.
James Longman with the picture there on the Venezuelan border, and James making an important point here, which is that inside Venezuela, at least according to the government, Maduro is still the rightful president. The acting president saying we await Maduro's return. And in fact, Maduro's son, who is also part of this indictment, speaking before the National Assembly there, saying his father was a good father and he looks forward to his return to Venezuela. You're looking live again, ABC News live coverage here of the arraignment on these charges, narco-terrorism charges in federal court, heavy security presence both inside and outside the court, as you can see. Because this is federal court, there are no cameras in the courtroom, but Aaron Katursky is inside, our chief investigative correspondent. With Nicolas Maduro standing, Aaron now reports that Judge Hellerstein read him the standard rights. I did not know of these rights. Your Honor is informing me of them now, Maduro said through an interpreter. How do you plead to the indictment, Hellerstein asked. That's the judge, of course. And here's Maduro's response, quote, I am innocent. I am not guilty. I am a decent man. I am still president of my country. Nicolas Maduro responding again. That is the headline of the moment here, given our live coverage, that Nicolas Maduro has responded in court to these charges just moments ago, saying, quote, I am innocent. I am not guilty. I'm a decent man. I am still president of my country. Dan Abrams?
Yeah, so not a surprise. The interesting thing that I was looking for was how much is Maduro going to try and give a speech in connection with this arraignment? And as you mentioned before, the judge cut him off. The judge said, that's not for right now. All you need to do right now is say that you understand what the charges are against you. He's pleading not guilty, and that's all. He'll have his chance to present his defense. He'll have his chance to get out there publicly if he so chooses with what his defense will be. But that's not the place for it right now. And as a result, we expect that this hearing will be pretty short. So we'll just have to see exactly how short it's going to be.
Dan Abrams, our chief legal analyst, with us here this afternoon. Dan, thank you. I want to bring in Rachel Scott into the conversation. She's at the White House for us. And Rachel, no question, the White House watching these proceedings unfold likely very closely here this morning as well. And we know that the White House also faces questions in addition to the charges that Maduro is facing. Obviously, these are drug trafficking charges. These are not charges related to the oil industry, although President Trump has repeatedly said that Venezuela took money, billions of dollars in oil revenue from the U.S., and he says that U.S. companies will now go into Venezuela, rebuild the infrastructure, help get Venezuela back on track. The president again last night, Rachel, declaring that the U.S. is in charge of Venezuela.
Yes, David, and that came after those conflicting statements from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. In the immediate aftermath of this capture, we heard the president come before the American people and say that the United States is now going to run Venezuela. He even pointed to the people who were standing behind him. You could see them in this photo right here. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and then Secretary of State Marco Rubio goes on television. He does a series of media interviews in which he says and tries to dial this back a little bit, saying that the United States is going to be running policy in Venezuela, and also saying that they will be using this oil blockade that is currently going on as leverage over the country. Then we saw the president on Air Force One make it very clear. He said flat out, point blank, the United States is now in charge of Venezuela. But there are still major questions today about what exactly that means. The president has not ruled out American troops going on the ground in Venezuela. He said in a response to a question about that, it depends on what exactly happens with the government. And then we heard that threat directly to Maduro's vice president, Rodriguez, saying that if she does not do what the United States wants her to do, then in fact, she could face a worse outcome than Maduro. That was a threat from the president there. So there's still a lot of questions here, David, on exactly how this is going to play out, and not a ton of answers from the United States on exactly what happens on the ground in Venezuela when it comes to the United States involvement in that area, David.
Again, you're looking at live pictures. Rachel, thank you. Lower Manhattan federal court. Nicolas Maduro, the ousted president captured by the U.S. military over the weekend of Venezuela, saying in court, I am innocent. I am not guilty. I am a decent man. I am still president of my country. He said, I am not guilty of anything mentioned here. responding through an interpreter inside that courtroom when asked to repeat his plea to the charges. Judge Hellerstein then turning to Maduro's wife, also in that courtroom. We told you moments ago that they're sitting not far from one another. Both are wearing headsets so that they can hear through an interpreter what is being said to them by this judge. Judge Hellerstein turning to the wife, she says, "I am Celia Flores. I am the First Lady of the Republic of Venezuela." The judge interjecting, saying the purpose today is just to ask you who you are. The judge then explaining her rights to remain silent and to be represented by an attorney. And she responded, "Yes, I understand, and I've heard that." That was the response from Celia Flores, Nicolas Maduro's wife, of course, also taken into custody by the U.S. military as they tried to get into that safe room. Asked how she pleaded to the 3 counts of the indictment she faces, Celia Flores responding, "Not guilty, completely innocent." So we've heard responses now from Nicolas Maduro saying, "I am innocent, I am not guilty, I'm a decent man," and declaring that I am still president of my country. And now Celia Flores, his wife, saying that she also is not guilty, completely innocent. She interjected, "I am First Lady of the Republic of Venezuela," but the judge then reminding her that the purpose today is to simply ask you who you are. Matt Rivers, who has covered South America extensively, he is in Bogota, Colombia for us. And as we stay trained on this courtroom in New York, Matt, your reaction here to what's playing out inside this courtroom, the president of Venezuela, the First Lady of Venezuela, both declaring their innocence here.
It's stunning, quite frankly. I'm personally not surprised that both Maduro and his wife tried to interject, tried to make their case a little bit there in court. Maduro, if nothing else, is a showman, and he knows very much right now that he is on the world stage in a way that he never has been before. But frankly, it is stunning that just a few days ago, he was running the country of Venezuela as he had for well over a decade, and now he is in a New York courtroom, David. It's something that I think the people of Venezuela are still struggling to even grasp, even fathom, because for better or for worse, Maduro was Venezuela. Internationally, he symbolized Venezuela. He was a larger-than-life figure for so many people in that country, and the swiftness, the suddenness, the brazenness of that attack, and the fact that they were able to extract Maduro from that country, I don't know that that's really sunk in for a lot of Venezuelans yet, as they grasp not only the U.S. doing that and what that means for their country in that moment, but also the future for Venezuela here, David. There is so much confusion, a lack of clarity about what the United States plans to do with that country and how that will affect the everyday people that have been, frankly, brutalized by the Maduro regime for a very long time.
And a question for you, Matt. Obviously, these charges are drug-related, narco-terrorism-related charges. But as you know, the questions in the aftermath of this U.S. military operation involved the oil largely. President Trump on the world stage clearly saying that the U.S. will move in quickly. U.S. companies will rebuild the infrastructure and recoup some of the money. And he said billions of dollars were lost to Venezuela after, in the last several decades, after the infrastructure was allowed to weaken, and with Maduro in power, claiming that the U.S. lost money. But the world fully aware of the relationship between Venezuela and China and Russia, and where that oil typically goes, the President Trump now declaring the U.S. is in charge of Venezuela.
No question about that, David, and I think the geopolitics of all of this really matter. Of course, President Trump wants to control the world's largest supply of oil, across the entire world, but he also wants to keep it out of the hands of China and Russia. China is the largest purchaser right now of Venezuelan oil, and President Trump has been very clear. He does not like that. He doesn't like the presence that China has in the Western Hemisphere. He is very open about the fact that he wants that oil sold inside the United States and to friendly nations around the world. It's not just oil and what it represents for the economy. It's also being used as a strategic tool in the game of great powers that is playing out between the United States and China at this very moment. So that is certainly part of the strategy here from the United States moving forward, as President Trump wants to get those U.S. oil companies back where they were for so many decades.
Matt Rivers, who has covered the region for quite a few years for us. Matt, we appreciate it. He is live in Colombia. We'll go back to him as necessary. And again, the breaking news here in New York City, coming to us from Aaron Katersky inside the federal courthouse here. Both Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, standing in that courtroom when called upon by the judge asking them if they understand the charges and asking if they can confirm who they are, summarizing the charges for them. Maduro standing, Judge Hellerstein reading him the standard rights, and Nicolas Maduro responding, "I did not know of these rights. Your Honor is informing me of them right now," he said. And then he was asked by the judge, "How do you plead to the indictment?" And again, as I mentioned, Nicolas Maduro declaring in that courtroom, but in essence for the world, watching not only here in the U.S., but around the world, these proceedings as they play out. Nicolas Maduro saying, "I am innocent, I am not guilty, I'm a decent man." And as I mentioned before, declaring that I'm still the president of my country. It was not long after Celia Flores standing in that courtroom as well, and she went on to say, "I am the First Lady of the Republic of Venezuela," which is when the judge interjected, saying the purpose today is to simply ask you who you are. Then a familiar scene playing out with her as well, the judge explaining to her her rights to remain silent, to be represented by an attorney. She said, "Yes, I understand this, I've heard this." And then when asked how she pleads to the 3 counts of the indictment that she faces, Celia Flores responding, "Not guilty, completely innocent." Martha Raddatz, we know there are proceedings playing out across town at the UN and the UN Security Council meeting to discuss the unfolding events in Venezuela, and you have new reporting?
Exactly. Just before these court proceedings started, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Mike Waltz, said he was an illegitimate so-called president. He said Maduro was not a head of state and emphasized that over 50 countries rejected the legitimacy of Maduro's re-election following the disputed 2024 election. He also said, and this adds to those mixed messages we are getting from the administration, with Donald Trump saying we are running the country, talking about possible boots on the ground, that they're not afraid to put boots on the ground. Mike Waltz just said that the U.S. is not occupying a country, calling the U.S.'s actions a law enforcement operation. He said his Secretary Rubio has said there is no war against Venezuela or its people. We are not, again saying we are not occupying a country, again saying this is law enforcement. The United States arrested a narco trafficker. But as we've heard, the president again reiterated that he believes we are now in charge of that country. Waltz also did add that the U.S. would not allow, as Matt was saying, would not allow the Western Hemisphere to be used as a base of operation for our nation's adversaries and competitors and rivals of the United States. And as you know, David, there have been threats to other countries as well from President Trump, Colombia, Mexico, Greenland, and what the U.S. may do in those countries. David.
Our chief foreign correspondent, our chief global affairs anchor, Martha Raddatz, with us here this afternoon as well. Martha, thank you. Just in from the courtroom, and in the moment that Aaron Katursky is allowed to leave this proceeding, he'll come out before the camera for us and give us color from inside that court. This is not expected to be a terribly long proceeding, though the color has been quite something coming from the courtroom. Right now, we are learning that the judge informing both Maduro and his wife, the First Lady, as citizens of the state of Venezuela, you have the right to consult with consular officials. We understand it, and we would like to have such visits, Nicolas Maduro answered. He took notes during the proceeding, Nicolas Maduro did, and he asked the judge for permission to keep those notes. He did not ask for bail. Mr. Maduro is not seeking release at this time, is what his defense attorney, Barry Pollock, said inside that courtroom. Celia Flores, likewise, not seeking bail inside that courtroom. The judge did, however, make it very clear that he's open to receiving a bail application in the future, but that the couple will otherwise remain detained at MDC Brooklyn, which is a jail detention facility not far away in terms of distance from this federal courthouse, though the way they had to get them to the courthouse was somewhat dramatic here this morning, being taken heavily fortified vehicles and then flown to the island of Manhattan and then brought to the federal courthouse in multiple steps here this morning. These are the pictures that we witnessed around 8 a.m. this morning as they were brought from Brooklyn to Manhattan by helicopter, and then from the motorcade waiting for them to bring them into that courthouse. Significant security outside the courthouse this morning. There have been protests. There are signs on both sides weighing in with different opinions on Nicolas Maduro being removed from power and the way in which this played out. As Martha mentioned, a remarkable U.S. military operation, one where there has been praise for simply being able to pull this off, the size and scope of this, how dangerous it was, and yet no loss of U.S. life. We did learn that a couple of pilots, according to Martha, were injured, but then still able to fly to leave the operation and to get through it 2.5 hours in total, and that Nicolas Maduro and his wife were captured in those final moments as they tried to get into their safe room, their safe house within the presidential compound. They weren't even allowed to have enough time to get that door closed, though President Trump, in speaking to the nation, made it very clear, even if they had closed that door, that it would have been a matter of seconds, that team on the ground that had studied that compound for quite some time in advance of this operation would have been able to blow their way through that door to capture Nicolas Maduro. Also coming in from the courtroom moments ago, Nicolas Maduro's defense attorney signaling the ousted Venezuelan leader may try to assert that he is entitled to protection from prosecution. Here's what the defense attorney said. This is the attorney for Nicolas Maduro moments ago saying, quote, of Maduro, he is the head of a sovereign state, adding that there are, quote, issues about the legality of his military abduction, calling this a military abduction. The attorney for the First Lady of Venezuela said that she was injured during the military operation and that she has requested a medical briefing, that Celia Flores has requested a medical briefing saying she was injured during the U.S. military operation. This is the quote from her attorney, quote, she sustained significant injuries. There's worry she may have a fracture or severe bruising on her ribs, according to her attorney inside that courtroom. The next date is March 17th. They've already been given the next date here, 11 a.m. in this very courtroom. The court has been adjourned. I'm told right now that Nicolas Maduro is being escorted out. I don't believe we're going to see him again. I think what we saw this morning was the extent of what we'll see, but the moment we see any movement on the ground here, of course, we'll bring that to you. We also know that Aaron Katersky, our chief investigative correspondent, who was inside the courtroom as all of this played out, he'll be in front of the camera just moments from now to provide color from inside the courtroom. But again, court has been adjourned. Nicolas Maduro being escorted out of that courtroom inside the federal court here in Manhattan. Both he and his wife will be returned to that detention facility. Unclear if his wife will receive this medical briefing and how quickly. It's fairly likely she will. Unclear whether that will just play out as well at that detention center in Brooklyn. Dan Abrams also following this, our live coverage with us here, watching this unfold, and not surprising really, Dan, to either one of us how quickly this unfolded here this morning.
No, not surprising. Interesting, though, that he's now preparing to challenge his abduction, which is an interesting question, right? Because there are real arguments that as a matter of international law, the U.S. should not have been able to simply go in and grab Maduro. Now, the position of the government is it was a law enforcement operation, that the military was just helping to back it up. That may be a tough legal argument, but now that it's done, it's going to be very hard for Maduro to say, well, they shouldn't have been able to take me. Why would it be so hard? Because he was indicted. I mean, he was a wanted fugitive, in essence. So even if you were to believe, yeah, the government shouldn't have been able to go in and do that, I can't see how they would reverse that now and say, yeah, you can go back even though he has been indicted in a United States court. So it's going to be an interesting legal debate, but I don't think it's going to be particularly dispositive.
Dan Abrams with us here this morning. Aaron Katersky has just made his way outside the courthouse into a microphone. And Aaron, your notes were extraordinarily helpful here. As Dan and I were just talking about, quite something to hear that Nicolas Maduro will likely claim that there are issues, legal issues, about his military abduction. And he declared in that courtroom through his attorney that he remains the head of a sovereign state.
He did, David. He said, I am the president. I am still the president of the Republic of Venezuela. His wife, Celia Flores, likewise said that she is the first lady of the Republic of Venezuela. And defense attorney Barry Pollock signaled that he will challenge the circumstances of Maduro's capture by the U.S. military. This is a tactic that Manuel Noriega tried when he was found to have surrendered to U.S. forces in Panama back in 1990. It did not work in the U.S. courts then. It may not work now, but he will certainly try. But the U.S. just doesn't recognize Maduro as a legitimate president. He certainly does. And as he stood before Judge Alvin Hellerstein a short while ago, he declared himself, I am Nicolas Maduro. I am innocent. I am not guilty. I am the president of Venezuela.
It did seem from the notes that you shared with us from inside the courtroom, Aaron, that the judge signaled fairly early on here that there would not be time for speeches, that will come in due time through their defense, that he was simply asking for them to confirm who they are, that they understand the charges against them, and ask them their plea. That both when Nicolas Maduro spoke and when Celia Flores spoke, the judge interjecting essentially in so many words saying this is not the time and place for that.
Exactly right, David. The judge did not want this to turn into any kind of a spectacle, and he wanted to keep this as ordinary as is possible, despite the extraordinary circumstances of how Nicolas Maduro got here. He is now being treated like every other criminal defendant in the dock here at Manhattan Federal Court. David, as the judge asked Maduro to affirm, he appeared to be prepared to go off on a lengthy speech declaring himself the rightful president of Venezuela, challenging why he was even here in the first place, and the judge just was not going to let him do it, at least at this stage. He said he would entertain motions in the future, and Maduro does not have to be back in court until March 17th. In the meantime, he is going to be detained at MDC Brooklyn, the decrepit federal jail where every other defendant awaiting trial here at Manhattan Federal Court is held. David, the defense said they would not challenge Maduro's detention at this point, although the judge said they have the opportunity to try and do that in the future.
Describe for me, if you will, Aaron, the scene inside that courtroom. They were both brought in. I know they were both shackled, brought to their chairs, seated not far from one another. Was there any sort of communication, even a glance between Nicolas Maduro and his wife sitting not far from him in that courtroom? How did this play out?
It did not appear that Maduro and his wife looked at one another, but they were seated with just a lawyer between them. And at one point, when the judge informed them of their right to be in contact with consular services, with someone from the Venezuelan consulate here in New York, Maduro answered for both of them and said, we would like to take advantage of those consular services, but otherwise it did not appear that Maduro and his wife interacted at all. Maduro was brought in first wearing beige pants, a black smock over an orange t-shirt, and orange jail slippers. He was escorted to a chair that the U.S. Marshals had flipped over to inspect. We've seen that before for high-profile defendants. They flipped over all the chairs at the defense table before Maduro was seated. His wife was then brought in next, wearing a very similar outfit, beige pants, black smock, orange t-shirt, took her place, kept her arms folded on the table, whereas Maduro himself took notes almost through the entire proceeding, and at the very end, he asked the judge for permission to make a request that he keep those notes, and the judge said that he could.
Aaron, as all of this was playing out, Nicolas Maduro's son, who is also under indictment, though he remains in Venezuela, speaking to the National Assembly there, where he's been a lawmaker for about 4 years now, since 2021. In a message to his father in front of the Venezuelan people, he said, "Dad, you created a strong family. The nation is in good hands while we await your return. I love you." That was the message from his son. There's the picture of the National Assembly there in Venezuela. Certainly, from the standpoint of the words that he used, somewhat hopeful that he'll see his father one day soon in Venezuela, but given the proceeding here today in Lower Manhattan, a stark reminder that is unlikely to happen. And in fact, the earliest we might see these trials begin could be some time from now, Aaron.
Oh, it could be months, if not a year or longer, David, before Nicolas Maduro ever stands trial on this 4-count indictment to which he, in rather dramatic fashion, pleaded not guilty. Rather than just say not guilty, he attempted something of a soliloquy saying, I am innocent, I am not guilty, I am a decent man, I am still president of my country, before the judge cut him off and simply said a plea of not guilty would be entered on his behalf. And Nicolas Maduro is going nowhere but back to jail in Brooklyn. He arrived here under heavy guard, David. There is still metal barricades and fencing stretching the length of the courthouse and beyond as protesters come here to the courthouse, some even cheering when Maduro, it was realized, had pleaded not guilty to those charges. Half the protesters are against what the United States military did, and other protesters are here saying this was the right thing to do, and the NYPD is keeping both groups apart.
Our chief investigative correspondent, Aaron Katursky, who was inside that courtroom today. We do have our chopper up in the air from WABC here in New York over the facility, should we see any of the movements here of Nicolas Maduro. There you can see the scene. We're not expected to see him like we did this morning around 8 a.m. and that carefully planned trip from Brooklyn, the detention center where he's being held, to Manhattan to get him to this federal courthouse. He and Celia Flores, the First Lady of Venezuela. But our chopper up in the air, and as soon as we see any movement here, we'll bring it to you. But in the meantime, I just want to get to the bottom line here, the breaking news this afternoon. Not only the U.S. watching this, but the world. Nicolas Maduro, the ousted Venezuelan president in that U.S. military operation over the weekend, now declaring in federal court in Manhattan, quote, I am innocent, I am not guilty, I'm a decent man, I am still president of my country. His attorney in that courtroom signaling which direction they may go now, questioning the legality, they believe, of this U.S. military operation. Celia Flores then asked if she in fact is Celia Flores. She said, I am the First Lady of the Republic of Venezuela. The judge interjecting, saying the purpose today is to simply ask you who you are. He explained to her her rights. She said, yes, I understand them. And she went on to declare her innocence in federal court here in the U.S. as well. Our coverage will continue on ABC News Live, abcnews.com. We're going to return to local programming. If there are any major developments, I'll be back on the air with the team. But we'll definitely be back with the entire team for World News Tonight. I'm David Muir in New York. I'll see you then. Good day.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
Keeps me in rhythm, quickly stopping migraine pain within 2 hours. And some have pain relief that lasts all day. So I can handle whatever the day may throw at me.